I let my daughter-in-law believe she'd won. I want to start there, because if I told this the way it actually happened, in order, you'd stop watching before you got to the part that matters. So I'm starting at the end. Not the very end. Just far enough ahead that you understand what was at stake before I show you what it cost. Before I go further, tell me something in the comments. If you're a parent, a grandparent, a son, a daughter, tell me where you're listening from tonight. I read every one. A quick note before we start. This story blends real experience with fictional details for the sake of the telling. Names, places, some specifics adjusted. But the truth underneath it is mine, and it's real. My name's Walter Coben. I'm 68 years old, and for 34 years I ran a construction supply company out of Toledo, Ohio, that I built from a single rented warehouse into something with my name on 4 buildings across 2 counties. I'm telling you that, not to brag. I'm telling you because it matters later. When a woman half my age stood in my own kitchen and told me I didn't understand what it meant to build something. It was a Sunday afternoon in late September, the kind of Ohio Sunday where the light turns gold around 4 o'clock, and everything looks better than it has any right to. My son Marcus was grilling in the backyard. His wife Renata was inside arranging a charcuterie board with the kind of precision she brought to everything. Like the cheese itself had to earn its place on the plate. There were maybe 25 people there. Neighbors. A few of Marcus's co-workers from the dealership he managed. Renata's sister, and her husband, up from Columbus. I want you to understand something about this house before I go on, because the house is the whole story. My wife Doreen and I built it in 1998. Not bought-built. I drew half the layout myself on a legal pad at my kitchen table when we were still living in a 2-bedroom rental on Delaware Avenue, and I brought those drawings to an architect I trusted and told him to make it real. 4 bedrooms. A wraparound porch Doreen wanted since she was a girl watching her grandmother sit on one in Kentucky. A detached garage out back where I kept my tools and, later, the '67 Mustang I'd been restoring, piece by piece, for 11 years. Doreen used to bring me lemonade out there on Saturday afternoons and sit on the stool by the workbench and read while I worked. She'd say, "You're not really fixing that car, Walt. You're just finding reasons to be near your own thoughts." She wasn't wrong. Doreen passed 14 months before that September party. Ovarian cancer, caught late. Gone in 5 months, from diagnosis to the funeral. I won't dwell on that here, because if I let myself start, I won't stop. And this isn't the place. But you should know that when she died, something in me went quiet in a way I didn't have a name for. I kept the house exactly as she'd left it. Her reading glasses stayed on the side table by the good armchair for 8 months before I could bring myself to move them. Marcus and Renata moved in about 4 months after the funeral. It made sense at the time, or it seemed to. Marcus said he didn't like the idea of me rattling around a 5,000-square-foot house alone, and honestly, neither did I. Renata had just had our granddaughter, Josie, and the idea of family under one roof, generations together, felt like something Doreen would have wanted. I told myself that a lot in those early months. I told myself that a lot longer than I should have. The first thing that changed was small. Renata reorganized the kitchen. Nothing wrong with that. On its face, it was going to be her kitchen too, and I understood that. But she did it while I was at a doctor's appointment, and when I came home, Doreen's recipe box, the wooden one her mother had given her in 1974, wasn't on the counter anymore. I found it in a box in the garage, under a stack of Marcus's old textbooks. When I asked Renata about it, she said, without quite looking at me, "I just needed the counter space, Walter. It's not like anyone was using it." Doreen had been dead 11 months at that point. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was grief making me sensitive, that I was looking for offense where there wasn't any. That's the pattern, if you're living something like this right now. It's never one thing. It's never big enough, on its own, to justify making a scene. It's 100 small things, each one small enough to swallow, until one day you look up and you're a guest in the house you built with your own hands, apologizing for existing in it. By the following spring, I'd stopped using the front sitting room because Renata said it read better as a formal space and didn't want it cluttered. My recliner ended up in the garage. My framed photos of Doreen came down from the hallway, replaced with a gallery wall of Renata's family, professionally shot, color-coordinated. When I asked where the photos went, Renata said they'd clashed with the new palette. Marcus stood in the doorway during that conversation and looked at the floor. I want to be fair to my son here, Because a lot of what happened isn't really about him, it's about what he became. Too tired, or too conflict averse, or maybe too in love to stop. Marcus isn't a cruel man. He's a passive one, and in my experience, passive men do more damage than cruel ones, because at least a cruel man knows what he's doing. Marcus just kept looking at the floor. The garage, my garage, where the Mustang lived, where Doreen used to bring me lemonade, became the next front. Renata wanted it converted into a flex space for Josie, who was 2 by then. A playroom. I understood the impulse. I really did. But when I came home one Thursday in June and found 2 moving men loading my tools into a rented storage unit without a word to me beforehand, something in me that had been quiet for a year and a half woke back up. I stood in my own driveway and asked Renata, calmly, why nobody had asked me first. She looked at me the way you'd look at someone who'd interrupted a meeting to ask an obvious question. It's not really practical to consult you on every decision about the house, Walter. You're not always, she paused there, like she was choosing a kinder word than the one she'd started with, up to speed on what the space needs to be for a young family. I asked about the Mustang specifically, where it was going. It's in the storage unit with everything else, she said. Honestly, I don't know why you're still working on that thing at your age. It's not like you're ever going to finish it. I want you to sit with that sentence for a second, because I did. It's not like you're ever going to finish it. 11 years of work. A car Doreen used to sit beside me for. Reduced to a comment about my age, delivered in the tone you'd use to tell someone their coffee's gotten cold. I didn't argue. I want to be honest with you about why. It wasn't peacemaking. It was strategy. Though I didn't fully know that yet myself. Something had shifted in me standing in that driveway, and it wasn't defeat, it was clarity. The following week, I drove to see a man named Preston Alvarez. I'd known Preston since 1991. He handled the legal side of my company for over 2 decades before he retired from corporate work and shifted into estate law. I sat in his office, in the same leather chair I'd sat in when we incorporated the business, and I told him everything. The recipe box, the photographs, the Mustang, all of it. Preston listened the way good lawyers do, without interrupting, without reacting, just taking notes and occasionally asking a clarifying question that made me realize I'd been sitting on more anger than I'd let myself admit. When I finished, he set down his pen and said something I've thought about every day since. Walter, the house is in your name, the land is in your name, every asset in that garage is in your name. You've been letting them treat you like a guest in a home you legally, fully own. The question isn't whether you have the power here. You've always had the power here. The question is whether you're finally ready to use it. I told him I was. Here's what most people don't understand about the kind of quiet dismantling that happens in families like mine, the reason it works. The reason grown men like me let it happen is guilt. Guilt is the most efficient tool anyone can use against you, because you supply your own labor. Nobody has to lock you in a room. You lock yourself in, out of love, out of not wanting to be the difficult old man, out of some deep fear that if you assert what's actually yours, you'll be the villain of the story instead of the fool. I spent the next several weeks building something Renata never saw coming, because she'd never once bothered to ask what I actually did for 34 years, or what kind of man builds 4 buildings from one warehouse. I didn't build a lawsuit. I built a foundation, literally, a registered nonprofit, the Doreen Coben Memorial Trust for Veterans Housing. Doreen's father had served in Korea, and she'd spent the last 3 years of her life volunteering at a transitional housing center for homeless veterans in Toledo. It was the truest expression of who she'd been, and it had been sitting in the back of my mind since her funeral as something I wanted to do properly, when I was ready. Renata's comment about the Mustang made me ready. Over 6 weeks, quietly, with Preston's help, I transferred the deed to the garage, not the house, just the detached garage and the 1/4 acre it sat on, which had always technically been surveyed as a separate parcel from when the property was subdivided in the 90s into the trust's name. I transferred the Mustang, fully restored value assessed at just under $90,000, into the trust as a fundraising asset, to be auctioned for veteran housing once it was finished. I set up a board of 3 trustees, myself, Preston, and a woman named Carol Bishop, who ran the transitional housing center Doreen had volunteered at, and who had known my wife well enough to cry, actually cry, when I told her what I wanted to do. None of this touched the main house. I want to be clear about that, because I wasn't trying to punish my son by taking his home out from under him. I was protecting what was mine to protect, in a way nobody could argue with, because nonprofit assets aren't subject to the kind of casual family reshuffling that had already claimed my recliner, my photographs, and nearly claimed my wife's recipe box. The moving men came back for the Mustang on a Saturday in October, 3 weeks before Josie's third birthday party, which Renata had decided, without asking me, to hold in the backyard, with the garage repurposed as a staging area for the caterers. I was in the kitchen when the flatbed truck pulled up. Not a moving truck, an actual towing flatbed, because Renata had decided, apparently on her own initiative, that the Mustang needed to finally be dealt with before the party, and had called a towing company to have it hauled to a junk auction, since, in her words to the dispatcher, it's just sitting there taking up space nobody's using. I walked out to the driveway. Marcus was standing near the garage door, arms crossed, saying nothing, which by then had become his signature contribution to any conflict in that house. Renata stood beside the tow operator with her sunglasses pushed up into her hair, going over paperwork on his clipboard like she was closing on a house. The operator, a heavy-set man named Gary with Cuyahoga County Towing stitched on his cap, looked up as I approached. "Afternoon. You Walter Coben?" I told him I was. He turned the clipboard around. "This vehicle here, the '67 Mustang, it's titled to something called the Doreen Coben Memorial Trust. That's a registered nonprofit. I can't move nonprofit property without board authorization or a court order. I explained that to the lady here already." Renata's head turned toward him slowly. "I'm sorry, what?" "Ma'am, like I said, this isn't titled to you or your husband. It's titled to a charitable trust. If I tow it without the paperwork, my company's liable, and depending how you slice it, could be looking at misappropriation of charitable property, which in Ohio is a felony matter above a certain dollar value. I'm not touching it." I watched something happen to Renata's face that I'd been waiting 14 months to see. Not anger, not yet. Confusion first. The specific confusion of a person encountering a version of reality she hadn't accounted for, hadn't thought to account for, because she'd never once considered that the old man in the driveway might be 3 steps ahead of her. "Walter." Her voice had that quiet, dangerous register people use when they're trying very hard not to shout in front of a stranger. "What did you do?" "I protected something that mattered to my wife," I said. "The car's not mine anymore, Renata. It belongs to a nonprofit that's going to house homeless veterans with the money it raises when that car sells at auction next spring. So no, nobody's towing it to a junkyard today." "You didn't think to mention this to the family?" "You didn't think to mention you'd called a tow company to junk my late wife's property before her granddaughter's birthday party," I said. "So I suppose we're square on communication." Gary, sensing with the instinct of a man who's delivered a lot of bad news to a lot of families that he was standing in the middle of something far above his pay grade, quietly closed his clipboard. "I'm gonna go ahead and head out. Y'all have a good weekend." He climbed back into the cab, and the flatbed pulled away down the driveway, leaving the 3 of us standing there in the October light. Renata straightened her blazer with 2 sharp tugs. I'd come to recognize that gesture over the past year as the sound of her regrouping and said, in a voice gone brittle and formal, "We'll discuss this later. Inside. Like adults." "And we will," I said. "But not tonight. Tonight I have somewhere to be." That threw her more than the tow truck had. "Somewhere to be? It's your granddaughter's party in 3 weeks, Walter, and you're telling me you have somewhere to be tonight?" "I have a meeting," I said. "With my attorney." I let that sit in the air the way you let a stone sit at the bottom of still water, watching the ripples reach the edges. Marcus finally spoke, for the first time since I'd walked outside. "Dad, what's going on?" I looked at my son, really looked at him, in a way I don't think I had in over a year, past my own hurt and disappointment in him to the tired, conflict-avoidant man he'd become, a man who loved his father and loved his wife, and had spent 2 years failing to protect either one of us from the other, mostly by failing to protect himself from having to choose. "What's going on?" I said, "Is that I spent 34 years building something with my hands, and I spent the last year watching it get dismantled, one drawer, one photograph, one recliner at a time, because I loved you both too much to say, stop." "I'm done saying nothing, Marcus. That's what's going on." I didn't wait for a response. I got in my truck, my actual truck, the F-150 I still drove daily, separate from all of this, because contrary to what Renata liked to imply, a man can own more than one vehicle, and I drove to Preston's office, where we finalized the paperwork that would matter for what came 3 weeks later. The birthday party arrived on a bright, cold Saturday in late October. I'd been quiet during those 3 weeks, not absent, not cold, just quiet, in a way that I think unsettled Renata more than open conflict would have. She'd expected a fight. 2. I gave her silence instead, and silence from a man who's already won is a different animal than silence from a man who's given up. I don't think she understood the difference until the day arrived. The backyard was full by 2 in the afternoon. Balloons, a rented bounce house, shaped like a castle, 30 or so guests, most of whom I recognized from Renata's side, her sister, her book club, a handful of Marcus's co-workers. Little Josie ran around in a paper crown, delighted and oblivious. In the particular way 3-year-olds are delighted and oblivious to everything except cake and attention. And God, I loved that child so much it made my chest ache to watch her. Preston arrived at 3, exactly when we'd planned, in a gray suit, carrying a leather folder. Beside him was Carol Bishop from the Veterans Housing Center, and behind them, unannounced to Renata, a local news reporter I'd invited from the Toledo Blade, who'd been wanting to run a piece on veteran housing initiatives for months and jumped at the chance to cover the unveiling of a new memorial trust with an actual restored '67 Mustang as its centerpiece fundraiser. Renata saw them cross the lawn and her whole posture changed. I watched her set down the drink in her hand champagne, in one of the good flutes from the china cabinet, the one Doreen had picked out on our 25th anniversary, and crossed the yard toward us with a smile stretched thin over something considerably less friendly underneath. "Walter," she said low, "what is this?" "This," I said, loud enough now for the yard to hear, because I'd decided 3 weeks earlier in that driveway that I was done handling things quietly for the comfort of people who'd never once handled me with any comfort at all, "is the public announcement of the Doreen Coben Memorial Trust. Preston, here is my attorney." He drew up the paperwork. "Carol runs the Veterans Housing Center my wife volunteered at for the last years of her life. And that Mustang you tried to send to a junk auction 3 weeks ago is going to raise close to $100,000 at a charity auction next spring to build transitional housing for homeless veterans in this county." The yard had gone quiet in that specific way. A room goes quiet when it senses something real is happening underneath the small talk. Marcus stood near the grill, spatula still in his hand, staring at me like he was seeing something he should have seen a long time ago. Renata's voice, when it came, was tight and controlled, pitched only for me, though half the yard could still hear it. "You did all this, the trust, the lawyer, the reporter, to embarrass me. At my daughter's birthday party. I did all this," I said, "to protect what was left of my wife after you took her recipe box off the counter and put it in a box in the garage under your old textbooks. I did this because you told me, in my own driveway, that a car I spent 11 years restoring with my wife beside me wasn't worth finishing because of my age. I didn't do any of this to embarrass you, Renata. You did that part yourself. I just stopped covering for it." Her champagne flute slipped from her fingers. It didn't shatter dramatically, it just tipped, spilled across the flagstone, and rolled to a stop against the leg of the folding table, and somehow that small, undramatic failure of her composure said more than a scream would have. Preston stepped in smoothly, the way good lawyers do, redirecting the moment before it curdled into something uglier in front of a 3-year-old in a paper crown. He spoke to the yard about the trust, about veteran housing, about Doreen genuinely, warmly, in a way that turned what could have been a scene of humiliation into something that actually honored what I'd built it to honor. Carol spoke after him, about the men and women the center served, about what $100,000 could do for a transitional housing program running on fumes. The reporter took notes. A few guests came up afterward and told me, quietly, that it was one of the most moving things they'd heard at a backyard party in years. Renata didn't stay for cake. She went inside, and I didn't see her again that afternoon. I want to tell you what happened after, because the after is really the point of this story, more than the reversal in the driveway or the party. 2 days later, Marcus came to find me. I was in the storage unit, of all places, going through the boxes of my old tools, deciding what to bring back and what belonged, now, to a different chapter. He stood in the doorway the way he used to stand in the garage doorway as a teenager, hands in his pockets, working up to something. "I should have said something a long time ago," he said, "about all of it, the recipe box, Mom's pictures, the garage." He looked at the floor, then made himself look back up, which I noticed, and which mattered to me. I let it happen because it was easier than fighting about it, and I told myself that made me a peacemaker. It didn't. It just made me a coward who let his father get erased out of his own house. I didn't have a speech ready for that. I just told him I forgave him, because I did. And because forgiveness, I've learned, is a thing you give for your own sake, as much as anyone else's. Marcus and Renata are still together. That's not the ending some of you might want, and I understand that I've heard from enough people over the years who wanted a cleaner kind of justice, a divorce, a dramatic exit, something with a bigger bow on it. That's not what happened. What happened is smaller and, I think, more honest. Renata and I don't talk much. We're polite at family gatherings. She's never apologized, not directly, though I've noticed my recliner found its way back into the sitting room about a month after the party, and nobody said a word about it either way. Some repairs don't come with an announcement. You just notice the furniture's back where it belongs. I moved out of the main house that winter, into a smaller place 15 minutes away, a 2-bedroom with a proper workshop out back where I keep what's left of my tools. I see Josie every week. I go to her dance recitals. I sit in the front row and I clap too loud, the way grandfathers are supposed to, and nobody has ever once made me feel like a guest for doing it. The Mustang sold at auction the following May for $106,000, well above what we'd projected, to a collector out of Cleveland who told the room, before he signed the check, that he'd read the whole story in the Blade and wanted to be part of it. That money broke ground on 11 units of transitional housing for veterans in Toledo the following fall. There's a small plaque at the entrance now. It has Doreen's name on it, and a line I chose myself, from something she used to say to the men and women at that center when they were scared to start over. We build the next thing out of what's left of the last one. I think about that a lot. Driving home from Josie's recitals, past the building with the plaque, past the 4 buildings with my name on them, that I built out of one rented warehouse 34 years ago. I think about how long I let myself be erased out of a life I'd built with my own hands, because I loved the people doing the erasing and couldn't find it in myself to be the one who said stop. Here's what I'd tell any father or mother sitting where I was sitting 2 years ago. Love is not the same thing as disappearing. You can love your children with your whole chest and still refuse to be moved out of the rooms you built. Don't wait as long as I did to remember that what's yours is still yours, even when somebody younger, and louder, and more certain of themselves, tells you otherwise. If any part of this story found you tonight, if you've ever felt like company in your own home, tell me in the comments. I read every one, and I mean that. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And if you haven't yet, subscribe, because there are more stories coming, and I think they're worth staying for. One last thing before I go. These stories on this channel blend real experience with fictional detail, shaped for reflection. If that's not what you came here for, no hard feelings at all, go find what feeds you. But if you're still here, thank you for staying. That's what we do in this house. We tell the truth, however we have to tell it, and we believe that in the end, family finds its way back to what's real, with or without an old man's Mustang to help it along.